Très bien. Écoutez, merci de nous avoir rejoints. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. En ce qui me concerne, Michel Bure, directeur général adjoint en direct de Rabat, de l'Université internationale de Rabat pour le congrès de la mission laïque française qui fête ses 120 ans. Et j'ai grand plaisir de saluer et d'accueillir Homa Tavangar et Will Richardson pour ce 5e et dernier rendez-vous des conférences parents, enseignants, personnel d'encadrement du réseau de la mission laïque française, du réseau MLF Monde. Une conférence que nous souhaitons ouvrir à tous les acteurs de la communauté éducative parce que l'on considère aujourd'hui, et c'est dans le background de Hélène Birch que je salue, repenser l'école ensemble si on veut construire un meilleur avenir pour nos enfants, pour les élèves que nous accueillons. Il faut qu'on puisse se mettre ensemble autour de la table, que l'on puisse débattre sur la base de débats, de conférences de haut niveau. Et on remercie très chaleureusement Homa Tavangar et Will Richardson de prendre la parole cet après-midi, ce matin, ce soir, tout dépend où vous êtes orienté dans le monde, pour un grand rendez-vous sur les questions de l'éducation aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup. Je laisse Hélène introduire nos deux conférenciers. Merci beaucoup. Et vous avez, n'oubliez pas, la possibilité de traduire en français, en espagnol. N'hésitez pas.
Merci beaucoup, Michel. I would like to make a very warm MLF welcome to Homa Tavangar and Will Richardson, who are the co-founders of the Big Questions Institute. We're very happy to have them here today. Through their work, Will and Homa consult with public, independent, and international schools to promote fearless inquiry and hope as they guide schools to design ways forward for this complex moment and uncertain future that we all face. What Will and Homa have to offer is a really great fit with our MLF network of schools, because between the two of them, they are experienced in and passionate about inquiry, culture, innovation, global citizenship, global competence, and the concepts of deep diversity, equity, and inclusion. Will and Homa recognize, as we all do, that schools and educators around the world are facing an epic design challenge going forward. And the big guiding question that they use is, how might educators and schools grow in these challenging times to create a more just, relevant, and sustainable experience of school for all students? And so with that, I pass it to Will Richardson, Homa Tavangar. Thank you so much for being here with MLF.
Well, thanks very much, Ellen. Merci. It's great to be here, and bonjour, and hola, and hey, if you're speaking Swedish out there. That's about everything I can say in all three of those languages, but it's great to be with you today for a short bit of time, at least, to talk a little bit about, as Ellen said, how the world is changing in an education sense and the ways in which we are being compelled to think differently about what an education is, about what the experience of school should look like for our children who are entering and on the precipice of what is a very uncertain and fast-changing future, and one that looks very different from the one that most of us grew up in. And we're going to talk a little bit about those contexts very briefly as well. We are going to save some time at the end of this presentation for questions, so please feel free to add those in the chat, and we'll have a bit of a conversation around some of the ideas that we want to share with you today. We want to just start briefly by giving you a sense of where we come from in our work, and we really believe that this moment is so fast changing and so very different from many of the kind of historic moments that we've lived through, and that we have to be as well informed and realistic as possible right now about what the current situation holds for us and for our children. And that to do that, we have to be able to tell some truths, not only about the world, but about school. We have to be fearless in the ways in which we question what's happening right now, especially in education. We have to be open to exploring and learning and unlearning, in fact, a lot of the things that maybe we've known in the past. And we have to carry hope into that process. So one of the ways that we do that is through what we call our 9 big questions. And we put out this free ebook. You can go to bigquestions.institute and download it for free. Share it with your friends. It is our way of beginning these conversations around change. We feel like this moment requires us to get to the fundamentals and the core questions about our work in schools, about why we have schools, what the role of schools are, their value, and why we want kids to be in schools. And let us say from the outset, we want children in schools. This is not a presentation that's going to suggest that we get rid of schools, but we are going to challenge you to think about what schools might be and the ways in which current iterations of schools are not serving our kids for the moment, again, for this moment and for their futures. So our first question there is, what is sacred? And obviously we don't mean that in a religious sense. We mean that in a sense of, if we could go into the future 20, 30 years and look at schools in the future, what would be the things that we want to keep? What would be the things that we wanted to make sure we're still there? And we start most of our presentations with this question, but because of the limited time we have today, we just wanted to put that question out there and share with you that in almost every case, what people have answered to that question really has nothing to do with the systems and structures that schools are about. No one ever says that curriculum and assessments and grades and all of those things are what's really important. What everyone always says is that it's relationships. It's about creating experiences that bring kids joy. It's about giving them agency and freedom and allowing them to pursue learning on their own terms. And we just want to, kind of start there, that really what this conversation is about is what is at the core here. What are the things that are really, really important that we can build from? And in order to do that, though, we have to have a pretty clear sense of how the world looks right now. And Homa's gonna just briefly give us an overview of how this moment is really, really challenging in so many ways.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, MLF. I am truly honored to join you. This is a very exciting meeting, and I'll try to speak clearly for the simultaneous translation. And I think that reflects this moment that we are in. We are so connected globally, and yet it is probably one of the most challenging times in history, certainly in my lifetime. And sometimes, particularly for all the parents and the educators joining, it might feel a little like this cartoon. And as you'll see in the picture, it's as if out there in the world, it is volatile, it's complex, it's uncertain, very few straight lines. At the same time, we strive to protect our children in a bubble and keep them from all the craziness of the world. We want to have schools that just give in the old way, that give a clear answer, a straight line from A to B. But at a younger and younger age, our students open the door, our children open the door, they look out to the world and they see, that old-fashioned straight line from A to B is not going to solve many of the problems that I will face when I go out into the world. So this is one of our fundamental challenges. And certainly since we've been living in through COVID, the whole world has experienced this together and at the same time, having very different experiences. It's changed our relationship to the world. And one essay that has helped us make sense of this change since the pandemic comes from the Indian writer Arundhati Roy. She says the pandemic is a portal. And what she means is that we can treat the pandemic as pandemics in the past have been, like a gateway between one world and the next that we are stepping into. And when we cross that portal, we can make a choice. And the choice is between dragging these carcasses, very strong language, the carcasses of our prejudice and our hatred, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or this is the choice. We can walk through the portal lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world, and very importantly, ready to fight for it. And so as we are talking about the changes in this world, we have this challenge to think about, what do we carry with us through the portal? The question about sacred says the most important thing are our relationships, are the connections, is the joy, is the sense of belonging. So we want to remember that even as we talk about the modern school in a changed world. And clearly, it is not just COVID that is creating this change. We globally are going through a reckoning of racism, colonialism, justice for all people. We are in the midst of a war in Ukraine that threatens so many more parts of the world. The extremes of wealth and poverty are becoming much more apparent as we have been living through the pandemic. We see democracy is under threat in the largest democracies in the world. The World Health Organization has diagnosed an infodemic, which is a crisis of telling the difference between truth and falsehood as more and more of us live our lives online, digitally. And certainly climate change is another huge crisis that must inform the way that we move forward. And I realize these are very difficult to just, give off in a list. And so as much as there is the external looking out to the world and all the challenges, it also is deeply challenging internally. And there is a mental health crisis among younger and younger children all over the world. So all of this, it lands on us differently. And there are reports throughout business journals, psychological journals that describe how our brains were not built for this much uncertainty. It is too much for many of us. So another quote that helps describe this situation comes from Adrienne Marie Brown. And she says that things are not getting worse, but they are getting uncovered. So all of these questions about extremes of wealth and poverty, democracy, climate, they are getting uncovered. So we must hold each other tight. We need to be there for each other. We need to create a stronger sense of connection and community as we continue to tell these truths and feel that weight of these truths. And so when it comes to schools, what we see is that what is being uncovered now is that in many ways, schools were simply not built for this world. Schools were built for a world that no longer exists. And that is one of the things that is being uncovered. And at the same time that we acknowledge schools were built for a different time, they are important places where children can reach greater heights, create and contribute beautiful and meaningful things for the world. And so there is deep value to schools. There are so many things that are sacred that really matter about schools. And we have to acknowledge it's not 1919 anymore. We do not live in that age, even though when you look at this picture, so much feels familiar. And at the same time, it is not even 2019 anymore. Our world has changed irreparably. We cannot go back. So when we look at this whole landscape of challenges and crisis in the world, we have to be honest as educators, particularly, and parents, and think about the responsibility that we must take that every one of these, in some ways, is a result of a breakdown in education, is a problem of education, that the inability to solve complex problems, think creatively, and collaborate has resulted in some of this breakdown. On the other side, to be more hopeful, we also believe that these great, great challenges can be solved by education. And so together, these problems make up, these crises, demand a new curriculum that is more relevant and more just. And so the new curriculum can look like a lot of new technologies like artificial intelligence, crypto economics, and also human technologies like character development, social and emotional learning, justice, equity, belonging, to be relevant in the world. And we look at this as other thinkers in education like Zach Stein, and this, we'll put up a long quote, but I'll just summarize. We look at this task of education today as a great design challenge. And the challenge is to imagine and create an education for humanity, not just an education that advances my individual child to get into the best university that they can, but that challenges my individual child to be part of a larger world and solve and consider the problems of our world today. And organizations like the World Economic Forum also agree, UNESCO, as we'll share later, that this new model of education is urgent and it is possible. So they have a model of an education framework that is as much about technology as it is about humanity. And so when we turn back to our 9 big questions as a frame for achieving this new education, our next question that we want to step you through is to consider what is learning.
So this is a really challenging conversation for a lot of people who are in education and for parents, frankly. Homa and I are both parents. Collectively, we have 5 children. And, you know, throughout their school careers, we have watched as much of what has been kind of traditional practice in schools has really been falling to a little bit more of irrelevance because it's not keeping up with the way that the world works, specifically with technology. And it doesn't really, in many ways, if we're going to be honest, remember at the beginning I said we're going to have to tell some truths. It doesn't really fit with the way that human beings learn. And so one of the questions that we put at the center of our work is for people and schools and school communities to articulate a shared and coherent definition of the word learning. And if we had time, we would love to engage you, the people who are watching this, in that conversation as well. Think of a time that you have learned really powerfully and deeply. What's happening in that moment? What's going on in that moment? And then to think about then how that kind of experience relates to what children are experiencing in schools. The tension here is that learning is maybe the most natural thing that human beings do. We can't not learn. We learn from the moment we're born to the moment before we die. We grow and evolve because we learn. It is how we navigate our lives. And increasingly in a complex environment, we're going to have to learn our way through our life in an even deeper level. And the tension becomes whether or not schools are preparing children to do that. The reality of it is schools are not natural places for learning to take place. And this is, we've created schools with the best intentions. Again, I don't want anyone to think, we don't want anyone to think that we're throwing teachers or educators under the bus. Not at all. We, by and large, with the schools that we work with, the educators that we meet, They care for children very deeply. They want what's best for children, but they are working in environments that do not comport to the way that humans learn. And that dissonance is problematic, especially in a world where our ability to learn has changed in the ways that it has right now. And we're going to talk about that in a second. There's an essay by a woman named Carol Black called A Thousand Rivers that captures this very clearly. And if we had more time, I'd read you a longer quote from this essay where she talks about how kind of it's almost difficult to defend why we split kids up into age groups, why we set particular kind of standardized goals for all kids when all kids are individuals and unique, why we create a number of the kind of structures and systems that we do in school if our goal is to develop children as learners. In many ways, really what we're doing is being efficient for the sake of schooling rather than effective for the sake of learning. And she has a quote at the end of this that is a really kind of a mic drop quote, if you will. And it's kind of unsettling, but if you think about it, it really is true when you consider this natural thing that we call learning in this kind of unnatural space called schools. She says, collecting data on human learning based on children's behavior in school is like collecting data on killer whales based on their behavior at SeaWorld. And that's a tough quote. That's a really hard kind of truth that that I don't think I think it's hard to argue that that's not the case. And here's the other reality. We all know this. Every one of us knows this because we've been asking this question, and I've been asking it for probably 8 or 9 years now. Homa and I have been asking it for the last 3 years with the Big Questions Institute to everyone. What are the conditions that are required when deep and powerful learning are happening? You know, what's needed? And again, if you think about times that you have learned really powerfully in your lives, what are the things that are happening in that moment, like I asked before? What's been fascinating is, and I'm not lying when I say that I've probably collectively, we've asked this question to over 100,000 people, parents, students, educators, leaders, community members. The answers that they give are so consistent that it's almost shocking. Almost everybody says that when powerful learning is happening, these are the conditions that exist, that it has relevance in their lives, that there's a real purpose for it in some way, that there is some choice and freedom and autonomy in the ways, in the things that they are learning about, that it's not constrained by time, and it's not just with people their same age, and all of these, right? And these all don't have to be present in that moment, but pretty much some of these have to be there. And you know, I'm betting that probably you're looking at this list and saying, yeah, that's pretty accurate description of what's happening in that moment when people are learning really powerfully. But equally interesting is what people never say when we ask the question, what are the conditions for deep and powerful learning? No one ever says, well, let's put kids in rows. That's a really good condition that will support learning. Or let's make sure they have no choice in what they're doing, that it's just about our assignment, the one that we give them. Or let's make it all about grades. That's a great way of getting kids to learn really powerfully and deeply. Or let's just hand it in. Let's make sure it doesn't have any real world relevance at all, and so on and so forth, right? And no one, when we ask that question, says those things. And if we were going to start a school together, if this was, let's start a school meeting, none of us would start with those conditions on the right-hand side. We would all begin with personal investment, relationships with teachers and mentors, those things that came up on that constantly come up when we ask what is sacred about schools. So it's a really interesting truth that we kind of live with in education. We want what's on the left-hand side of this slide, but we really, in most schools, do what's on the right-hand side of this slide. And there's a dissonance there. And now in this moment, it's really hard to keep living on the right-hand side when so much of the ways that we can learn now are driven by our own sense of autonomy and agency and the technologies that are out there. Learning in the world has exploded. We don't need to send children to a place to be with a particular teacher on a particular day with a particular group of kids who are their particular age, to go through a particular curriculum at a particular pace and be assessed in a particular way, because content and knowledge and teachers are everywhere now. And that is the world that they are going to live in. They're going to live in a world where they will have access to pretty much the sum of human knowledge. And there's a lot of bad information that's represented in this picture. We all agree. And kids have to be able to understand what is accurate and what isn't, what's true and what's false, what's fact and what's fiction. If they can't do that, then they are not going to be literate. They also have access to potentially 5 billion teachers. And there are some not so good people in this picture as well. And kids need to be able to identify those who really want to support them and help them, as opposed to those who want to do them harm. And they also have access to literally millions of different technologies and apps, some of which are really great, some of which are problematic. But the point here is that this world that we're living in right now is not the world that schools were built for. Schools were built for a time when knowledge and teachers and technologies were scarce. And so we brought the teachers and the students and the technologies and the knowledge together in one place. That's not the reality of the world today. That doesn't mean that we abandon schools or that we don't send kids to a place to be with adults and other kids. But it means that the experience that we build for kids in those schools has to be radically different right now. And more people now are beginning to acknowledge that. And more people are beginning to say, we are falling further behind in the ways that we are preparing kids for the worlds that they are going to live in, because we are stuck in these legacy narratives and stories and practices and systems that have been around for well over a century at this point. And while they've changed on the edges, have not changed fundamentally at the core. So you have places like Coursera, where you can take any course pretty much that you want. And we could list hundreds of these examples of places where we can go and learn what we want, when we want, or when we need it. And again, the reality of it is that more and more kids are getting connected. And I know this is a research study on the US, but if you look at global studies, access is becoming more and more ubiquitous through the devices that we carry in our pockets. And if we don't think that those devices can be powerful learning devices, then we're not understanding what the potentials and the affordances are of those technologies. So what's happening is the narrative or the story that we tell around what an education is being redesigned already. It's starting to happen. The old narrative says that basically you need to go to school, you need to play by the rules, you need to work hard to get good grades and good test scores, and then go to college and get a degree so you can get a good job. And in that kind of story, we see education as something that's really scarce, that it's highly competitive, and that it's absolutely required, that you can't be successful, depending on how you define that, but you can't certainly be financially successful if you don't have a degree. Well, that narrative is breaking. There's no question about it. There's a new narrative that's emerging, and it is along the lines of, look, if I have access and if I know what to do with it, I can create my own school. I can find my own content. I can connect to my own teachers, and I can develop my own passions, solve real problems, do real work in the world. And by the way, end up getting paid very well for that. There are literally millions and millions of stories now of people who are successful in the financial sense without having a college education. And also, by the way, successful in a personal sense. Because they're not tied to that competitive, high stress, anxiety type of path forward. So in this narrative, education is abundant and it's tacit. It's not explicit. It's something that we learn from one another. It's impactful and it's something that we really want. Now, kids are beginning to understand this, and basically more and more students now are beginning to question whether or not they need to go through that traditional path. And what's kind of propelling that is the idea that the standardized testing industry is beginning to realize that a lot of those tests are not, there's no equity there, there's no equality within the tests, and that they really don't measure what a child can do. And that businesses now are saying, we are ignoring a huge pool of people who don't have college degrees at our own expense. And so many corporations now are dropping the degree requirement. They're saying, let's go and find creative, self-motivated, self-directed learners who are out there doing great things already without having to go through that traditional narrative. And let's figure out how they can help us. And by the way, even Harvard is saying, look, why don't you might want to consider taking a year off. You might want to consider, by the way, just, not just rushing into college before you have a good understanding of who you are and what you really want to do. And give yourself time to pursue a special project or activity or work or do something else that's meaningful to you. So the narrative is really, really beginning to shift. And what's important for us right now then is to figure out, how do we embrace all of these narratives in schools? How do we make it clear to kids that they have many pathways forward? Again, we're not saying that you shouldn't go to college. That's not the message here. We're saying college is one path, and there are many, many others now that are building and that are becoming much, much more accessible to our children. And to not give them the opportunities to take advantage of those and to not prepare them to learn their way through the world is to not prepare them for the types of challenges that they are going to face as they move forward. Now, the good news is that there are a number of schools that are already beginning to make that shift. And, we'll just take a look at a couple of them, and then we'll have some time here in a few minutes to open it up for some questions. So please feel free to add your questions into the chat, and we'll spend some time having a conversation.
So that's right. So schools are already changing. And I know that many people, Will and my experience talking to educators all over the world, is that even in very traditional schools, many of the leaders realize this challenge. It's not 1919 anymore. It's not even 2019. We must move forward in a way that is relevant to the world as it is. So we want to share a few examples of individual schools. And the first example is a consortium of close to 400 schools around the world. It's predominantly in the United States, but a growing number of schools around the world are joining the Mastery Transcript Consortium. And as you see, this is just one snapshot on the slide of schools in India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Bahrain, Kuwait, Kentucky, Massachusetts, and elsewhere that are joining this consortium. And what that means, it's a crusade to end grades in high schools. Parents, educators, and especially students are saying, do not reduce me to a number. I am more than a grade. My creativity, my curiosity, it really cannot be captured in one number. So let's create a way to assess our knowledge, our learning in a robust way that is more than one grade on a test at the end of the year or the end of the unit. And so there is this group around the world building a new sort of a transcript. So that's one example. we also see in individual schools some very exciting initiatives. So this is a periodic table of attributes, qualities, experiences that comes from the Avenues School. And that's a school that is setting up campuses around the world. But, you know, you can see, for example, one of the elements is something like empathy. And they have learning outcomes that are connected to empathy. And it's more than simply a soft skill that you can say, okay, we don't have time for that. We want to focus on the hard skills. One more school that is in India is the Riverside School, and they've really been leaders in design thinking and design with students. And like the design challenge that we are thinking about an education for humanity, they are building a school for the world where they are thinking about how we do work that is relevant to the challenges of the world today. So, just wrapping it up before we go into some conversation, thinking about the way forward, we begin with the questions, and we encourage you, you got a link, we can post the link again, to download our 9 questions book. It is free. We want as many people to have conversations about these very challenging questions and consider the future of their schools. We do have a Spanish translation available, not yet a French translation. So it's a short book. If anybody wants to take on that challenge, we'd love to talk to you about that. And, you know, explore these questions. There's a lot that we want to leave you with 2 quotes. One is from UNESCO. They recently did a very important study on reimagining our futures together for education. And they make this very strong statement that merely expanding the current educational model is not a viable route forward. We cannot keep expanding and adding and adding. That we need to question why and how we educate and the ways that we organize learning today. We need a new social contract for education that can repair injustices while we transform and prepare for the future. And this really is about our existence. It is an existential choice. Do we continue on this unsustainable path, which we have inherited from the reality of centuries ago, or radically change course? And radical means go to the root of the problem. And so we want to close with one more quote, and this is about hope. So as challenging as this scene for education is today, and as hard as it is to be a parent, we have hope. And yet it is hope with action. As Mariam Kaba said, hope is a discipline. It is a commitment to the future that must manifest action. So we can take small steps, even at home, that make that difference, and to live out what gives us hope, even in this extremely challenging time that we are all navigating through. So we want to carry hope with us through this portal post-pandemic. And here is our contact information. Please look up the Big Questions Institute. We have a community that is growing of educators and parents around the world that are engaging in challenging conversations, supporting each other, so that you don't have to be alone in having these conversations, in talking about these issues. We're very excited about your association having your first in-person conference since 2019, and we hope this discussion can continue when you gather together, and we will open it up. We have time for questions. So thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Muchísimas gracias. Love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Giving us lots of things to think about. Please let us know your questions. Drop those in the chat.
I do see some questions in the chat. Why doesn't our actual education develop life skills? And I think there have been a lot of questions about what this education for humanity means. And also, just to clarify, based on a previous question, we are definitely centering relationship. We are definitely centering human qualities as we move forward in a modern world. I think that without that, we get lost. Our children get lost. So please know that we want to center students, and that includes centering student voices. So we need to listen to our students and understand what works for them in schools. How often do we ask them, what do they enjoy? What do they care about? What problems do they want to solve? I think that's one piece of this centering relationship. And I think the other piece is this idea of, why doesn't education develop life skills? I think because we are inheriting an industrial era education, a factory model that was preparing students for a world of work that has in large part disappeared. So you didn't need a lot of complex communication or empathy skills to work in a factory doing the same process day after day. That has changed.
I would say too that I think the reality of it is in school that one of probably the skill they learn best in school is how to do school, how to be successful in school. I know that, I was a teacher for 22 years, and I had lots of kids who came up to me and said, "Hey, Mr. R, I need 3 points for a B. Can I, take the test over? Can I do extra credit?" And I had very few kids actually, or comparatively few kids, who said, "Hey, I really want to learn more about what we're talking about in class." And look, some of that's on me. Obviously, I probably could have done a better job in terms of making sure that my students were able to pursue things that they really wanted to learn more about. But, and I've seen this in my own children too, the ways that schools are set up right now, it really is about doing well in school. And most of, or very much of, and research shows this over and over and over again, much of what kids quote unquote learn in school that is content and knowledge based is quickly forgotten after the test is taken. The things that they do hold on to are the skills that we hopefully are developing in them. And there's no question right now, if you have children, they better be the best learners that they can possibly be. If they're going out into the world waiting for someone to tell them what to learn, when to learn it, how to learn it, and how they're going to be assessed on it, good luck to them. It's the kids who are going to go out and know how to, and have the skills and literacies and dispositions to pursue things that are of interest to them and go really deeply and develop expertise in those areas, and then find ways to create a life out of that. Those are the kids who are going to be most quote unquote successful and most fulfilled at the same time. So that's a challenge that we have right now.
Should I go ahead and answer questions that I see in the Q&A, Ellen? Do you want to read those, or?
Thank you. Yeah, I missed those. I'll read them out. That sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you. Our challenge is to change schools within the framework of a national curriculum, French in this case, which leaves little leeway. Do you know of any state schools that have managed to break down the old model of education?
So we have many examples. It is very hard. It's much harder to retrofit an existing school, a state school, into a new model. But there are many examples. Many people are striving to do this. We work with many state public schools, for example, across Canada, including Quebec. And, some of this, we have a question in the book, where is the power? Is a perception that if I work in a state public school, I have no power. I must follow the direction of the exam, of the state curriculum. But what we find, especially when educators support each other, they find their power, their voice, and they are able to create an alternative, even if you have to take the exam. And many times the students are doing a great job on the exam if they have to take the exam, even with some of the new approach that we're advocating. So it's hard, but it is possible.
I would say too, just really fast, if there are 3 examples of countries or provinces, let's say, that have done educational change at a kind of high level, like you're asking about, Francois, I would say British Columbia is the first that comes to mind in Canada, where over the last 10 years, they have developed what they're calling the British Columbia Ed Plan, which is a framework that moves away from standardization, creates much more space for student agency for learning on their own terms, project-based learning, and has really opened up a new way of thinking about what the experience of school is. You can find the BC Ed Plan. That's one place to start. Taiwan is another country that has really reframed what is important to know and be able to do once you leave school. And it is much more about moving away from individual success to the success of not just the collective or the community locally, but the country and humanity, if you will. So they are in the process of reframing based on starting with what's important, which was really one of the reasons why we wrote our book too, because we wanted to get those questions down to the fundamental, discussions about what our work is. And then the third example would be New Zealand. New Zealand has always had a fairly, I would say, evolved way of thinking about what schools might be. And, it's easier in a place like Taiwan and New Zealand, which is kind of a small, contained country. It's obviously not as big as France, certainly not as big as the United States. And if you're following what's happening here in the United States, it's kind of a mess right now. So, it's easier if you're in a place like that. But those are models of places, I think, where they have undertaken a national conversation around what the realities of the world are today, and what that means in terms of the fundamental purpose and value of schools and what an education should be. So it is happening, but as Homa said, it's really difficult.
Here's another one. How can we adapt and find new practices? Maybe how can we get to know our students as teachers without relying solely on parents? How do we get to know them better, their qualities, and how they learn best?
So I'm not sure what the part about without going through the parents means exactly, but look, I think just in general, if you're in a school and you want to at least engage in some conversations around significant change, transformative change, and I don't use that word lightly, right? Where you really are beginning to change the power relationships in schools. You really are beginning to think about the experience and what an education is differently. The first thing you have to understand is that it's a long-term process. It's probably a 10-year process to really get to the changes that are fundamental. And the second part is that the first few years of that is simply spent engaging in capacity building conversations with parents, with students, with community members, with policymakers, asking questions and saying, is this really valuable? You know, is this what we should continue? Should we continue to use these kind of anxiety producing standardized nationalized tests that put so much pressure on kids, especially in this moment, right? When so many kids are already feeling so much anxiety. Is it really the best way that we can think about doing schools, to separate things up into subjects like this? Because the world doesn't separate up into subjects like this. We don't, none of us in watching this or in this room do math for 45 minutes and then go and learn another language for 45 minutes and then go out and play for 45 minutes. And it's just not structured in the same way. And, you know, again, at the end of the day, if you have a coherent definition of learning, then does your budget support that definition of learning? Does your curriculum, do your assessments, all of that, right? So it really is trying to get common language at the very beginning of the process, just common language about what's important, what do you mean when you say certain things, and to get a baseline for what's working and what's not working. And then to think aspirationally, well, where do we want to be in 10 years? And then try to fill those gaps. I think parents have to be a partner in that. They have to be a very important voice in that conversation with students. But it's, again, it's a long-term conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Parents, we need to take time to create community and to educate parents. If you have a different vision for how we should move forward, we can't do it sort of behind the parents' back, or else they will have a revolt and not allow you to continue. And we have seen that in a lot of places. It sounds obvious, but it's really important. Parents will be our partners if we have this conversation with them from the beginning. And you can start with our first question. Ask them, what is sacred about school? What matters the most? They will not say grades or exams. They will say relationship, connection. We see it everywhere in the world. And then involve the students in really substantial conversations, not just what's your favorite ice cream, your favorite color. You know, talk about some of these strategic questions. What matters the most? And we often learn the most when we have the conversation with students. They're very clear-minded most of the time. There's an expression that we love to use that kind of goes with our question, who is unheard? Because the structures we all grew up with were very exclusionary. You did not have someone that looks like me or comes from where I come from at the table making the decision. But today we see things differently. There's a different possibility. And there's an expression, nothing about us without us is for us. I'd love to hear the translation in all the languages, but nothing about us without us is for us. Means if you're going to make a decision about me, bring me on. I will inform you, and then we'll go forward together. That seems very basic, very simple. You do not need a PhD to realize that, but that's not the way the world has worked. And so in some ways, this is revolutionary.
Wow. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup à vous deux. C'était vraiment, je crois, un grand moment et sans doute une intervention majeure qui conclut superbement ce cycle des 5 conférences. Merci vraiment de ce que vous nous offrez et heureusement que nous avons cet enregistrement pour pouvoir revenir dessus. Hélène, you can say exactly the same in a better English than mine, please. Merci beaucoup à toutes et à tous.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Will and Homa, for this extremely relevant, timely, and important conversation. Thank you for articulating that for us. And thank you, everyone, for being here, part of this conversation. And we look forward to continuing that conversation at the MLF Congrès and beyond that. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with our community today. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, and we'd love to stay in touch and hear about the outcomes from the Congrès.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Be well.